In 1961, Italian archaeologists digging through ancient ruins near the Sea of Galilee discovered a limestone block. Carved into its weathered surface was a name that would send shockwaves through the historical community: Pontius Pilate. For the first time, physical evidence confirmed the existence of the Roman prefect who, according to the Gospels, ordered the execution of Jesus Christ. But here's the question that keeps historians, skeptics, and believers debating to this day. If we can prove Pilate existed, what evidence do we have for the man he supposedly condemned? Welcome to Logic over Spirit, where we examine the world's most profound questions through the lens of reason, evidence, and critical thinking. Today, we're tackling one of the most controversial questions in human history. Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? And if so, what can we prove about his life and death? This isn't a question about faith. This isn't about whether he was divine, performed miracles, or rose from the dead. Those are matters of belief. Today, we're asking a simpler, more fundamental question. What does the historical evidence tell us? For nearly 2,000 years, Jesus Christ has been the central figure of Christianity, influencing billions of lives, shaping civilizations, inspiring art, philosophy, and moral frameworks. Yet despite this massive cultural footprint, the historical Jesus remains surprisingly elusive. We have no writings from his own hand, no contemporary accounts from neutral observers, no archaeological artifacts that definitively prove his existence. So what do we have? And more importantly, is it enough? Over the next several minutes, we'll examine the evidence like detectives at a crime scene. We'll look at ancient manuscripts, Roman records, Jewish texts, and the testimonies of both believers and skeptics from the ancient world. We'll explore what religion says, what philosophy teaches, and what history can actually prove. By the end, you'll have a comprehensive understanding of one of history's most debated questions. Let's begin our investigation. Chapter 1: The Silence That Speaks. Here's something that should trouble anyone seeking historical truth about Jesus. Not a single contemporary account exists. No Roman official documented his teachings while he lived. No Jewish scholar recorded his miracles in real time. No Greek philosopher mentioned his name during his lifetime. Think about that for a moment. If Jesus truly performed the miracles described in the Gospels, healing the sick, raising the dead, feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread, wouldn't someone have written about it? Wouldn't Roman administrators, meticulous record keepers that they were, have documented such extraordinary events? The Roman historian, Seneca the Elder, lived during Jesus' lifetime. So did Philo of Alexandria, a prolific Jewish philosopher who wrote extensively about religious matters in Judea. Neither mentioned Jesus. Not once. This silence is deafening, but does it prove Jesus never existed? Not necessarily. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell noted, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Most people in the ancient world left no trace. Even significant figures often vanished from the historical record. Jesus was, by all accounts, a peasant preacher from an insignificant corner of the Roman Empire. His movement was small. His influence during his lifetime was limited to a handful of followers. From a historical perspective, we wouldn't expect contemporary documentation of every itinerant preacher in first-century Palestine. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, wandered the countryside claiming divine inspiration. Most are forgotten. The question isn't why Jesus wasn't mentioned during his life, but rather, why did mention of him appear so quickly after his death? The earliest New Testament writings, Paul's letters, date to roughly 20 to 30 years after Jesus' supposed crucifixion. That might seem like a long time, but in ancient historical terms, it's remarkably close. Paul, writing to various Christian communities in the 50s CE, treats Jesus' existence as an established fact, not as a controversial claim requiring proof. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day." Paul claims he's passing on information he received from earlier sources, pushing the tradition back even further, possibly to within a few years of the events themselves. But Paul presents us with a philosophical puzzle. He never met the living Jesus. His knowledge comes from visions and from conversations. With those who claim to be Jesus' followers, can we call this historical evidence, or is it merely testimony about testimony? The philosopher David Hume warned us about accepting miracle claims based on testimony alone. He argued that the evidence for the regular course of nature is so overwhelming that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony is of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact it endeavors to establish. Yet even Hume's skepticism doesn't address the basic historical question. Did a man named Jesus exist and die in first-century Palestine? Miracles aside, what can we establish about the person at the center of these early Christian writings? Here's where the evidence begins to accumulate in unexpected ways. Chapter 2: The Hostile Witnesses. If you want to prove someone existed, sometimes your best evidence comes from their enemies. And Jesus had enemies, powerful ones, whose writings have survived. Let's start with Josephus, a Jewish historian, born just a few years after Jesus' supposed death. Writing around 93 to 94 CE, Josephus penned Antiquities of the Jews, a comprehensive history of the Jewish people. In this work, he mentions Jesus twice. The longer passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, has been hotly debated for centuries. It reads, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as to accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah, and when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." Now, here's the problem. Josephus was not a Christian. He was a Jewish historian working for Roman patrons. The phrases, "if indeed one ought to call him a man and he was the Messiah," sound like Christian interpolations. Later additions by Christian scribes who couldn't resist embellishing the text. Most modern scholars believe the passage originally existed, but was modified by Christian copyists. If we strip away the obvious Christian additions, we're likely left with something like this. Josephus acknowledged that a man named Jesus lived, was known as a teacher and wonder-worker, was crucified under Pilate, and that his followers continued to exist decades later. The second reference in Josephus is more straightforward and widely accepted as authentic. He mentions the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. This brief reference is significant because it's casual, almost offhand. Josephus isn't trying to prove Jesus existed. He's simply identifying which James he's discussing. This is exactly the kind of reference we'd expect from a non-Christian source. But let's move to an even more hostile witness, the Roman historian Tacitus. Writing around 116 CE, Tacitus had no love for Christians. He considered them a destructive superstition, and their beliefs absurd. In his Annals, describing Nero's persecution of Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, Tacitus writes, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. Called Christians by the populace, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome." Think about what this passage tells us. Tacitus, writing from Roman archives and hostile to Christianity, confirms that a person called Christus was executed by Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. He had no reason to invent this. If anything, he had reason to deny it if he could, but he couldn't, because the basic facts were too well established. The Roman philosopher and satirist, Lucian of Samosata, writing in the 2nd century, mocked Christians and their crucified sage. He writes sarcastically about the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. Again, hostile testimony, confirming the basic narrative. Even the Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries, but containing earlier traditions, mentions Jesus, though in unflattering terms. These references speak of a man named Yeshu who practiced sorcery and led Israel astray, who was hanged on the eve of Passover. The specifics are distorted, polemical, designed to counter Christian claims. But beneath the hostility lies an acknowledgement. There was a person, he had followers, and he was executed. The ancient Greek philosopher Celsus, writing around 178 CE, produced one of the earliest and most comprehensive attacks on Christianity. His work survives only in fragments quoted by the Christian writer Origen, who was refuting him. But what's fascinating is what Celsus doesn't dispute. He doesn't claim Jesus never existed. Instead, he attacks his origins, calling him the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier, mocking his followers as gullible, and dismissing his teachings as derivative. This pattern repeats throughout ancient anti-Christian literature. Critics attack Jesus' character, his teachings, his followers, but they don't deny his existence. Why? Because in the ancient world, even his harshest critics couldn't plausibly make that claim. As the historian Bart Ehrman, himself an agnostic and skeptic of Christian supernatural claims, states, "The idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedents. It was made in the 18th century. One might as well call it a modern myth, the myth of the mythical Jesus." Chapter 3, The Gospels and the Search for the Historical Core. Now we turn to the most controversial sources, the Gospels themselves. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These texts are religious documents, written by believers, for believers. Can they tell us anything reliable about the historical Jesus? Let's be clear about what the Gospels are not. They are not objective biographies written by neutral observers. They are theological texts, written decades after the events they describe, shaped by the beliefs and needs of early Christian communities. They contradict each other on details. They contain supernatural claims that, from a historical perspective, cannot be verified. But does this mean they contain no historical information? Not necessarily. The question is how we extract the historical core from the theological overlay. Scholars have developed criteria for identifying potentially authentic historical material within the Gospels. One important criterion is called multiple attestation. If a saying or event appears in multiple independent sources, it's more likely to be historical. Another is the criterion of embarrassment. If the Gospels contain information that would have been embarrassing or problematic for early Christians, they probably didn't invent it. Let's apply these criteria. Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist appears in multiple Gospels. It also creates a theological problem. If Jesus was sinless and superior to John, why did he need John's baptism of repentance? The Gospel writers struggle with this awkwardness, each trying to explain it away. This suggests the baptism actually happened and was too well known to be omitted. Similarly, Jesus' crucifixion is attested and deeply embarrassing. In the first-century Roman world, crucifixion was the most shameful, degrading death imaginable. It was reserved for slaves and rebels. The idea that the Messiah, the anointed one of God, would die such a death was scandalous. As Paul himself admits in his first letter to the Corinthians, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. If Christians were inventing a Messiah from scratch, they would never have chosen crucifixion as his fate. The fact that all four Gospels, Paul's letters, and multiple non-Christian sources agree on this point suggests its historical bedrock. The Gospels also preserve sayings and parables that don't obviously serve the early church's theological agenda. Jesus' emphasis on the imminent kingdom of God, his cryptic references, his association with social outcasts, these details fit awkwardly with the more developed Christology of later Christianity. They bear the marks of authentic tradition. But here's where philosophy enters the picture. What does it mean for something to be historical? The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrestled with this question in the 19th century. He argued that historical facts, no matter how well established, cannot compel faith. He wrote, "If the contemporary generation had left nothing behind them but these words, 'We have believed that in such and such a year that God appeared among us in the humble figure of a servant, that he lived and taught in our community, and finally died,' it would be more than enough." Kierkegaard's point is profound. The historical existence of Jesus, and even the fact of his death are, philosophically speaking, neutral facts. They don't automatically lead to Christian faith. Many people accept that Jesus existed and died without accepting any supernatural claims about him. The Gospel of Mark, widely considered the earliest gospel written around 70 CE, presents a very human Jesus. He gets angry, frustrated, tired. He asks questions to which he doesn't seem to know the answers. He's abandoned by his followers and dies with a cry of desperation. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Later, Gospels progressively elevate Jesus' status, smooth out rough edges, add birth narratives, and resurrection appearances. We can watch the legend growing. But beneath the layers of developing theology, there seems to be a historical figure. A Jewish teacher from Galilee who challenged religious authorities, attracted followers, and was executed by Rome. The philosopher and New Testament scholar Rudolf Bultmann, writing in the 20th century, argued that we should demythologize the Gospels, stripping away supernatural elements to find the existential truth beneath. He believed the historical details mattered less than the meaning and challenged Jesus' teachings present. But even Bultmann didn't doubt Jesus existed. He wrote, "The doubt as to whether Jesus really existed is unfounded and not worth refutation." No sane person can doubt that Jesus stands as founder behind the historical movement, whose first distinct stage is represented by the Palestinian community. Yet we must also acknowledge the limitations. We cannot reconstruct a detailed biography of Jesus from the Gospels. We cannot know with certainty what he actually said versus what was attributed to him later. We cannot verify any supernatural claims through historical methods. What we can say is this: the Gospels, despite their theological purposes, preserve traces of an actual person, a Jewish teacher in first-century Palestine, whose life and death sparked a movement that changed the world. Chapter 4. The Archaeological Whispers. Archaeology rarely provides smoking gun evidence for individual historical figures, especially peasants from 2,000 years ago, but the archaeological record can corroborate or contradict the broader historical context in which Jesus supposedly lived. Remember that limestone block discovered in 1961. The Pilate Stone, found at Caesarea Maritima, confirms that Pontius Pilate was indeed prefect of Judea, exactly as the Gospels claim. Before this discovery, some skeptics questioned whether Pilate existed at all. The stone's inscription reads, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea, has dedicated to the people of Caesarea a temple in honor of Tiberius. This matters because the Gospels get the details right. Pilate was prefect, not procurator, as later Roman historians incorrectly stated. The Gospels, written decades after the events, preserved accurate information about the political administration. In 1968, archaeologists discovered an ossuary, a bone box, containing the remains of a crucified man from the 1st century. The man's heel bone still had a nail driven through it. This was the first physical evidence of Roman crucifixion, confirming that the practice was used exactly as described in ancient texts. The man's name, according to the inscription, was Yehohanan. He was nobody famous, just another victim of Roman execution. But his remains prove that Jewish men in 1st century Judea were indeed crucified, precisely as the Gospels claim happened to Jesus. In 1990, archaeologists discovered another ossuary inscribed with James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, while its authenticity has been debated, with some claiming the brother of Jesus part is a modern forgery. If genuine, it would be the first physical artifact directly referencing Jesus. The debate continues. But even skeptical scholars note that the names and relationships fit the historical period perfectly. More recently, archaeologists have excavated 1st century Nazareth, Jesus' supposed hometown. For years, skeptics argued Nazareth didn't exist in the 1st century. Archaeological evidence now confirms it was a small Jewish village during exactly the right time period. It was insignificant, just as the Gospels suggest, but it was there. The pool of Siloam, where John's Gospel says Jesus healed a blind man, was discovered in 2004. The pool of Bethesda, where another healing supposedly occurred, was excavated and matches John's description precisely, including the detail that it had 5 colonnades. These discoveries don't prove Jesus performed miracles at these locations, but they do something equally important. They demonstrate that the Gospel writers knew the geography and architecture of 1st century Jerusalem, suggesting eyewitness tradition, or at least reliable sources, not pure fabrication. From a philosophical perspective, archaeology reminds us that history is embedded in physical reality. The ancient world was not a mythical dreamscape but a concrete place where real people lived, built, died. The more we excavate, the more we find that the world described in the Gospels actually existed. But we must be careful. As the philosopher and historian R.G. Collingwood warned, archaeological evidence must be interpreted, and interpretation is always influenced by our presupposition. A coin, a building, a stone, these are mute. They speak only when we ask them questions, and the answers we hear are shaped by the questions we ask. Still, the cumulative archaeological evidence paints a picture of 1st century Palestine that aligns remarkably well with the Gospel narratives, at least in terms of geography, politics, and cultural practices. This doesn't prove Jesus existed, but it makes the Gospels more plausible as historical documents containing genuine historical memories. Alongside theological interpretation. Chapter 5, The Verdict of History and Reason. So, what can we actually conclude? Did Jesus of Nazareth exist? Did he die by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate? The overwhelming consensus among historians, including secular scholars with no religious investment in the answer, is yes. Jesus was a real person who lived in early 1st century Palestine and was executed by Roman authorities. This conclusion isn't based on faith, it's based on the same historical methods used to establish the existence of any ancient figure. We have multiple independent sources, both friendly and hostile. We have archaeological corroboration of the historical context. We have the emergence of a movement that requires explanation. Could all the sources be wrong? Could Jesus be a mythical figure who invented whole cloth? Theoretically, yes. But this requires us to believe that multiple independent sources, written within decades of the alleged events, all fabricated the same basic narrative. It requires us to explain how a myth could generate such specific historical details, correct titles for political officials, accurate geography, and realistic social dynamics. It requires us to explain the sudden emergence of Christianity without a founder. Movements don't spontaneously generate, they need catalysts, and in the ancient world, that catalyst was typically a charismatic leader. The philosopher John Stuart Mill, though not a Christian himself, wrote, "About the life and sayings of Jesus there is a stamp of personal originality combined with profundity of insight. That if we abandon the idle expectation of finding scientific precision where something very different was intended, we must recognize in the Sermon on the Mount, a teaching which was, and remains, truly original and profound." Mill's point is that the teachings attributed to Jesus have a coherence and originality that suggests a real person behind them. Not a committee of myths, but let's address the mythicist position fairly. Proponents argue that Jesus is no different from other dying and rising God myths in the ancient world. Figures like Osiris, Dionysus, or Mithras, they suggest early Christians simply adapted existing mythological patterns. Here's the problem with this theory. First, most scholars of comparative religion reject the close parallels claimed by mythicists. The differences between Jesus and pagan gods are more striking than the similarities. Second, the dying and rising god pattern doesn't explain the specific historical details in the sources. Why invent Pontius Pilate? Why set the story in recently conquered Judea? Why create a crucified Messiah when that concept was theologically problematic? Third, and most importantly, we have evidence of Jesus' existence from non-Christians who had no reason to perpetuate Christian mythology. Tacitus actively disliked Christians. Josephus was working for Roman patrons. The Talmudic references are hostile. Yet all acknowledge a person named Jesus who was executed. The historian, Michael Grant, who specialized in ancient history, wrote, "If we apply to the New Testament as we should the same sort of criteria as we should apply to other ancient writings, containing historical material, we can no more reject Jesus' existence than we can reject the existence of a mass of pagan personages, whose reality as historical figures is never questioned." From a philosophical perspective, the question of Jesus' existence intersects with broader questions about historical knowledge. How do we know anything about the past? We weren't there. We rely on testimonies, documents, artifacts. All history is reconstruction based on incomplete evidence. The philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey argued that historical understanding requires empathy, the ability to imaginatively reconstruct the mental life of people in different times and places. We must understand the worldview of first-century Jews, the political realities of Roman occupation, the religious ferment of the period. When we do, the existence of a figure like Jesus, a Jewish teacher who challenged both religious and political authorities and paid with his life, makes perfect sense. What we cannot establish historically is anything supernatural. The resurrection, the miracles, the divine nature of Jesus, these are matters of faith, not history. History deals with natural causes and effects. It cannot pronounce on theological claims. As the philosopher Immanuel Kant observed, religious truth and historical truth are different categories. Historical investigation can tell us what happened in the empirical world. It cannot tell us the ultimate meaning or metaphysical significance of those events. So here's where we stand. The historical evidence strongly supports the existence of Jesus of Nazareth as a Jewish teacher who lived in Galilee and Judea gathered. Followers taught in parables and provocative sayings, entered Jerusalem at a volatile time, was arrested, and was crucified under the authority of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, probably around 32-33 CE. Everything else, his birth narratives, his miracles, his resurrection, his divine nature, these require faith. They lie beyond the reach of historical methods. But the basic fact of his existence and death, that we can affirm with reasonable historical confidence. Conclusion: the quest for the historical Jesus is ultimately a quest for truth in a world where truth is often obscured by bias, wishful thinking, and polemics. Whether you're a believer seeking to ground your faith in history, or a skeptic demanding evidence before belief, the question deserves serious engagement. What we've discovered is that the evidence, while not perfect, points strongly toward the existence of a historical figure behind the Christian story. Multiple independent sources, hostile witnesses, archaeological corroboration, and the very existence of Christianity itself all suggest a real person at the origin. But we've also learned humility. History is not mathematics. We deal with probabilities, not certainties. We reconstruct the past from fragments, knowing our picture is incomplete. The religious person and the philosopher can both find value in this investigation. The religious person can take comfort that faith is not built on obvious fiction. The philosopher can appreciate that even our most sacred stories are rooted in human history, subject to the same methods of inquiry we apply to all knowledge. As you leave this video, I encourage you to continue the investigation yourself. Read the primary sources. Study the historical methods. Engage with scholars on all sides. Question everything, including what I've told you. If this video challenged your thinking, sparked your curiosity, or gave you new tools for understanding this ancient question, please like this video and subscribe to Logic Over Spirit. Share it with someone who's wrestling with these questions. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your questions, your disagreements. And remember, the pursuit of truth requires courage. It means following the evidence wherever it leads, even when that destination surprises us. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and always choose logic over spirit when seeking what is real. Thanks for watching.